So this one's called What We Know About SNAP Shoppers, Preliminary Findings from a Little Bit of ERS Analysis. Some slides that Joanne and I have put together just on some background information to put some context into some of the barriers that SNAP participants may be facing in making healthier choices. Okay, so as Dr. Witecki said, the SNAP program serves a diverse low-income population. Basically, to be on SNAP, the main criterion you have to meet is you have to be low income. In fiscal year 2012, 82% of all SNAP households were living below the poverty line. 75% of all the households had either a child, an elderly person, or a disabled person in the household. The majority of SNAP households with children have earned income. I think Dr. Kincannon said 31% are working. Half of the SNAP households with children are single-parent households, and about 41% of the single household with children are working. So all this says is that most SNAP participants fall into the category of being working poor and probably face very real-time constraints with children and managing a job. And as Dr. Witecki and Dr. Kincannon pointed out, like most Americans, SNAP participants have a hard time choosing a healthy diet. They're eating too few of the things that are recommended for a healthy diet, like whole fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and they're eating too much of the things like sodium, extra calories, and added sugars. And this means that, well, we know that there's a correlation between continued poor diet quality and health outcomes. And as Dr. Witecki pointed out, they're more likely to be overweight, obese, and also more likely to have a history of diabetes, heart conditions, and stroke. So this is not a new challenge. As Mary mentioned, this is a series of 3 workshops. But what the focus of today is to look at how low-cost to no-cost interventions, or nudges as the term is, can be used to encourage SNAP participants to make healthier choices while recognizing that they do face real-time and income constraints. And so I saw this at a presentation, and I thought it was a really nice way to get everybody kind of on the same page about how to think about this issue. This is a framework developed by people at an organization called Ideas 42. They're a nonprofit organization that works to apply behavioral economic interventions to a wide range of social issues. And it's a 4-step process that I think is a real nice, helpful way to think about things. So I think we've defined the problem already. SNAP shoppers are not purchasing healthy foods, and because it's a SNAP program, we can really focus on the foods that they're purchasing for at-home consumption at grocery stores and supermarkets. So the next step is to diagnose the problem and to kind of think about, to go through each step of the process of what people know, what people buy, what people cook, to identify potential bottlenecks, and then to brainstorm on ways to use behavioral-based interventions to overcome some of these barriers. And then the final piece, and the most important piece, is then to think about ways to test whether or not these interventions work as they were intended to work. And so with that, I'm going to present a few background slides. These data come from the Flexible Consumer Behavioral Survey that ERS partnered with the National Health Center on Statistics and the NCHS that worked to collect data for the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So the NHANES data collects really great information on what people eat, some of their socio-demographic characteristics, and program participation. But for a while, there was no real information on whether or not people knew what they were supposed to eat, whether or not there were significant differences in shopping patterns. So in 2007 and 2008, ERS fielded a set of questions, and it's ongoing, and some of the questions change over time. And we also added a few questions in 2005 and 2006. So the results of this presentation are basically 2007 to 10 data, but there's a few 2005-06 questions in there too. So the typical way to encourage people to choose healthier foods has typically relied on talking about what's a healthy diet, why it's important to have one. So the FCBS had some questions to see if there really were some differences in what people know about diet and health. And from these data, so I'm going to just quickly say how, I'm going to present a lot of these kind of column charts and then some table charts. And all of the column charts, if something is grayed out, it means that they do not significantly differ from the SNAP participants. The blue column is always income eligible non-participants, and the green columns are higher income non-participants. So we see that SNAP participants are less likely to say that they have heard of some of the dietary guidance programs. At the time of the question, they were the dietary guidelines, My Pyramid, the food guide pyramid. But then there's also a set of questions that then say, okay, so do you know what you're supposed to eat? And they say, for somebody with your calorie pattern, do you know how many servings of fruit and vegetables you should take in, how much dairy, et cetera, et cetera? And there are some significant differences, but you can't say that they are less aware of what they should be doing. So in terms of, say, dairy, they are actually closer to being correct than the higher income respondents. When you look at meat, everybody's pretty well aware of how much meat they should be eating. And an interesting one is everybody seems to overestimate how much whole fruit they should be eating. And it's also interesting given how little whole fruit everybody eats. So it doesn't seem like lack of information is necessarily a bottleneck. And then there's another set of questions that look at, are there any discernible differences in what people value when choosing foods at a grocery store? And so they ask people to rank how important they think factors such as price, nutrition, convenience, and how well something keeps is how they rank that when they're purchasing a food. And so this is just yes or no, did they rank this as important or very important? And I think a really interesting thing to take away from this chart is that everybody ranks taste most importantly, and there's no significant difference. And then among non-participants, they rank nutrition as the second most important attribute, but SNAP participants still rank that more important. But in between nutrition and taste, SNAP participants also indicate that they think how well food keeps is a very important attribute. And finally, and then I think another thing to take away is that on every attribute, SNAP participants indicate that something is more important. So they're really trying to balance all these different constraints. And because these people are low income and they're working, they do seem to feel more constrained. And we see that they do spend less per person than higher income non-participants at grocery stores. They also spend less money on eating food away from home. And we saw that although they value convenience more than non-participants, the SNAP program is designed to encourage food purchases at home. So if they value convenience, they may have to rely on more processed foods at grocery stores. We also see that they are less likely to shop weekly or more, and they're more likely to shop once a month. That may be why they put more emphasis on how well something keeps. That may also tie in with their monthly, how the benefits are distributed once a month. And it also may tie in with the fact that they seem to travel longer to get to the grocery stores. On average, it takes them a few more minutes to get to the grocery store, and a higher share of SNAP participants live more than 30 minutes from a grocery store. But do these constraints really matter? And it's really hard to tell with cross-sectional data. So we just put together a couple more charts that suggest maybe they do. So if we look at the difference between people who shop weekly or bi-weekly compared to those who shop monthly, we see that those who shop monthly or less do score lower on the HEI scores, and that these differences are significant for both non-participants, income-eligible non-participants, and higher income non-participants, and it's weakly significant for SNAP participants. And then we also see that if somebody lives more than 30 minutes from a grocery store, they are less likely to shop monthly, more likely to shop monthly, less likely to shop regularly. So this idea of access really probably does play into the types of foods some people are purchasing. But beyond these more typical constraints of time and money, we also see that that SNAP shoppers might just be a little less pessimistic, more pessimistic about the value of dietary change. The FCB asks questions about whether or not they the respondents think there is a reason to change their current diet. There are also some questions on whether or not they think they have a healthy diet. I didn't present those here, but they are more likely to say that their diet is not healthy. They're also more likely to say they're in poor health. And then statistics show that they do choose a lower quality diet and they are less healthy. But they're still more likely to say there's no reason to change their diet. And there's also a question that asks whether or not they believe this would have an effect on their health. And they're more likely to agree with the statement that some people are born fat and some are thin, and there's just not much you can do about it. So this may affect how likely they are to think that making changes is going to have any sort of payoff, but it may also indicate that nutrition and diet quality is not going to be a top-of-mind concern for a lot of these participants. And then another interesting finding is that SNAP participants they score a lot higher on this depression screener. It's been fielded since 2005, and a score of 10 or higher is typically used to indicate that somebody is clinically depressed, and 25% of SNAP participants show up as depressed. So I think a real challenge is motivating this group that's already constrained and juggling a bunch of things and pessimistic about the value of making these changes. So some takeaway points are that SNAP participants value nutrition just as much as other consumers, but given the fact that they're more likely to shop once a month and have a harder time getting to stores, balancing that with time and money constraints, it's a really challenging task. And so we're going to hope for the rest of the day we get some insights into how to handle this situation. And so I'm going to go back to this figure because David is next going to talk about some of the idiosyncrasies in decision-making that might kind of also create bottlenecks or barriers to making healthy choices, and ways in which the choice environment can be altered to knock down some of these barriers. And then Tim is going to talk about how we know that there's also supply-side issues. And so in order for any of these interventions to be workable, they have to be a win-win solution that works for both retailers and consumers. And so with that, we'll go on to the next one.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks to Lisa and Joanne for organizing this meeting. You've done a spectacular job just looking around the attendees. I'm excited about this. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about what drives consumer behavior. And I'm going to try and focus a little bit on SNAP participants, although I want to keep it somewhat broad and general so that, the creative juices can kind of flow, and those who see applications that maybe I don't could recognize those and bring those out in some of the discussion. So far, if you go and look at the literature right now using behavioral nudges and food consumption, we've seen actually a good amount of work in a variety of settings. We've seen in the home that replacing small plates or putting small plates in the home rather than large plates, you can actually have an impact on how much people eat and how often they eat. We've also seen several experiments, both Brian Wansink and myself have conducted in restaurants and cafeterias, as well as many others, but I'm citing myself instead. And also in lunchrooms, and I thank both the undersecretaries this morning for mentioning this work that I feel is really important, where we've seen pretty substantial changes in the types of foods that children eat and they will consume when we make some very subtle changes, simply rearranging the foods and the order they're presented and how visible they are and convenient they are. And I think there's a lot of potential to do exactly those sorts of interventions within schools across the country, and we're making progress. The way these nudges work, and this is important, the way these nudges work are really based on sort of three big principles, and I want to drive these principles home, and I'll talk about them more in depth as I go along. Basically, people, when it comes to food, are latent decision makers. And what do I mean by that? I mean they're checked out. They are not sitting and making these decisions the way you would expect somebody to make decisions about their Wall Street investments, right? Although we know from other literature that people don't necessarily make their Wall Street investments that way either. Beyond that, we feel it's really important for people to be making their own choices and to feel that the choice, that the food that they have chosen was their own choice, and that they will behave very differently if they believe they have that choice rather than believing that they don't have that choice, which is related to this last principle of reactance, which is really this pushback when you feel like your freedom is threatened in some important way, or even in some unimportant way. And the results of that reactance can be devastating to policies that have health goals that try to target long-term habits. So those are the three basic key principles that we need to keep in mind as we go through this exercise. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about some of the tools. I, of course, can't talk about all of them. I'll try and focus on things where we have some evidence about how it works with respect to food. And, like I said, talk a little bit about how we can focus this on SNAP recipients. So just to sort of set the stage, one result we've seen, just to demonstrate exactly how people respond in ways that may be a little unintuitive. Traditional economics tells us what? It tells us that people should eat in an all-you-can-eat setting, for example, until the next slice of pizza, or in this case pizza, or whatever it is they're eating, becomes a negative, right? Becomes something that's actually diminishing your utility, or taking away from your utility. And so, does this really happen? And if that does happen, you would expect then that how much people paid in order to get into that all-you-can-eat restaurant shouldn't have any impact on what they then eat, right? It shouldn't affect it whatsoever. And if we did see that it affected it, we'd be subject to what we call the sunk cost fallacy, which is probably one of the oldest behavioral concepts in economics. So, trying to figure out if this happens, we went to an all-you-can-eat pizza place and approached people on the way in. We offered half of them a free drink, and the other half we offered a free drink and half off the price of their meal. And as you see here displayed, when we charge them more, they eat more. They eat about one slice more, which in this case is actually several hundred calories, which is important. Saying that what? They're eating to get their money's worth, right? They're not just eating for the experience, they're eating for a whole bunch of reasons. And in this case, it's leading them to do something that's rather strange. And even stranger than that, when we go back and look at how much they enjoyed the pizza and whether they thought it was good pizza or not, those who didn't like it ate about a half slice more. Okay, and you might wonder to yourself, why in the world would you eat a half slice more if you don't like it? Well, it takes a lot more bad pizza than good to get your money's worth out of this, right? So we can see some really perverse results when people are checked out and they're pursuing other goals, things that economists tend not to think about to begin with. You might also go out and look and find that there are a whole bunch of different sizes of things that are referred to as normal. Soda is one of the most interesting examples because there's such a debate over how much soda we should drink. You see here, a soda can, which you might consider to be sort of normal size, is about 12 ounces. If you go to McDonald's, that's your child size. You can also see if you look in the top right corner, if it's not too dark to see, here's an old picture of a poster advertising 2 full glasses in each 12-ounce can of soda, right? So it tells you that there's a really wide range of what we might consider normal and what we would accept as a normal size. And we wanted to figure out exactly what this was doing and how consumers take this information and use it when they're eating. And so we conducted a bit of an experiment. And let me see if I can get this to play. There we go.
Don't know they are part of an experiment. Because we scheduled this around lunch, we serve a meal and measure out 8 ounces of pasta for everyone. But listen closely to what this professor tells them as he casually mentions how much they'll get.
We'll be serving you a double portion of pasta. A double portion of pasta?
And the next group,
we're going to give you a half portion of pasta.
A half portion of pasta. The next, full. A good meal is had by all, but then,
hi everyone,
we let them in on our little secret.
Forks down.
You guys, we're just part of a little experiment. Those who think they have regular portions They ate it all up, except for her. She says it was too cold. And the ones who believe they're eating the half-size portion, they quickly join the Clean Plate Club.
I was looking for the other portions.
Hey, where's my other half? The students who think they have a double portion all left some food.
Double portion doesn't sound like a portion you should eat.
So in other words, they're taking this as information, direct information about how much they're being served. They can see what's on their plate, and in our experiment, we actually, we labeled the sizes of how much was there. They feel how full they're getting, and still, this label suggests to them how much they should eat, and they're taking it as information. And in our experiment that I think Colin is all too familiar with, we actually found this, that you end up having people leave almost twice as much on their plate when you call it a double portion versus calling it a regular portion. That means you're eating about 140 more calories just by giving something a smaller sounding name, okay, per meal. That's a pretty good key as to how people can get distracted and pay attention to things that really don't make much difference in the end. So I talked about these sort of three key principles. The first was that people are making latent decisions. We make, according to one study anyway, between 200 and 300 food decisions every day. And with that many food decisions, we can't really put ourselves into any one decision. We've got to fall back on rules of thumb. We've got to fall back on habit and other things like that. And those rules of thumb and those habits don't necessarily change to fit every situation. And so they lead us to make some mistakes. And those also happen to be the rules of thumb and the habits that we can use in our favor to guide people to make better and healthier decisions. Okay? So, for example, and I'm hoping Colin Pena will actually show this later and talk a little bit more about this. You go to a grocery store and you look, you have a nearly uncountable number of options to choose from. And how do you do it? How do you decide where and which ones? And if you look up there are dozens of varieties of some items. And what tells you which to choose? It's not you sitting there cognitively going through each possible choice and weighing the nutrition information on the back of panel for each of them. It just wouldn't work. You wouldn't have time. You wouldn't do anything else with your life. Right? So we've got to fall back on something else. And actually, people like it when you give them some sort of guidance. And not guidance like, we gave you an informational website beforehand, but guidance in the moment on what it is they should be choosing. And that's the sort of guidance we can provide in that nudge. The second principle I talked about was this, one of the principles I should say was reactance. This pushing back on authorities, right? And I have an anecdote that I always share in this regard that demonstrates the issue. And it demonstrates, I think, in a really important way. There was a school in the southern tier of New York that we had been working with where they were worried about added sugar in the diet. And because they were worried about added sugar, they limited each student in the cafeteria to taking one packet of ketchup with their lunch. And if you have one packet of ketchup, you can maybe cover a tater tot and a half, right? There's not much you can do with that one packet of ketchup. And the kids were understandably angry about this, right? They were angry about it, angry enough that the seniors ended up throwing a protest. And the protest was this. They're graduating from high school, they walk across the stage, and as they shake the hand of the principal, they hand him a packet of ketchup. And so by the end of this day, this principal has an entire pocket full of ketchup. And you might think to yourself, well, if that's the whole protest, this wasn't necessarily that bad, right? Didn't really do any damage. The principal can handle that ketchup, right? But if you think about it, what it says is you haven't captured their hearts and their minds. And so when they're in other contexts, when they're at McDonald's or at Burger King, they're not going to say to themselves, I'm only going to take one packet of ketchup because those nice people at school told me that's what was good. Instead, they're going to start grabbing handfuls and handfuls and demonstrating or proclaiming their freedom and independence from their school, right? This is the problem with that sort of approach. We need to find some way that is non-confrontational. And that leads to this final principle that I'll mention, which is attribution. Attribution is this value of choice. And it's difficult to explain in lay terms, but let me give you a demonstration through an experiment that we had. We had a group of 4-H students, I should say 4-H campers, that came in for lunch. And we put them into two different treatments. One group, we would just say, here are some carrots with your lunch. Okay? And the other group, we would ask them, would you like carrots or celery with your lunch? They had to have the carrots or the celery, but we asked them which one they wanted, right? There were more, in fact, about 20% more that ate carrots when they had the choice of celery than when they didn't, right? Almost all of them chose carrots because celery is celery, but more of them ate the carrots. And why? Because they had to go through the action of thinking to themselves, which one do I like more? And they chose the carrots, and in that process, built themselves a preference for carrots that they wouldn't have had if we had just said, here are carrots. Okay? That's the attribution. And because they did it and they chose it themselves, they own it, and they're much more likely to make that same choice in the future. So what we know generally about food decisions, oftentimes we'll model this as if we have a dual decision process, right? If you're familiar with thinking fast and thinking slow, this is the same idea. We really have these two different decision mechanisms. One is deliberative and rational, and one is emotional and sort of knee-jerk. And which one takes precedence is determined basically by how many cognitive resources we have available. But it could be a bunch of other things. If you've looked at some of the research by Sendhill Mullainathan, right, it tends to tell us what? That we can end up being pushed into what we call a hot state by scarcity or by a lack of any one thing, right? Be it food or time or money, whatever it might be. But when we're in that hot state, it's going to be harder for us to resist temptation. And just to demonstrate exactly how we can use this, we ended up going into an upstate New York school, and we gave them, we ran an experiment. Some kids would be brought in, and they would order their lunch in the lunchroom as normal while they're facing, all of the food that they have the choice of, and when they're hungry. And the other group would order in the morning before they were in that hot state, when they had just finished breakfast, presumably, and weren't staring all those foods in the face. And what we found, when they're in that cold state, they're 11.8% more likely to take fruit. They're also 9% less likely to take snack foods. And one of the biggest results, they were 25% less likely to take starchy sides, right? So even kids who probably aren't as concerned about future health as adults or parents, for example, respond to this cold state. And we can actually use that. And so in this hot state, we're likely going to be going for taste and convenience. For size, we're going to be looking for things that are immediate and going to give us some sort of boost right now. Where in the cold state, we're going to be thinking like an economist. Okay? We're going to be looking at health and prices, and we're going to be using logic to decide what it is we're going to buy. And what this says is if we're going to affect those SNAP shoppers, we have to learn to talk to the distracted shopper, okay? We have to use these tools of convenience. We have to make it the easiest thing to reach and something that seems like it's going to be the easiest thing to use once we get it into our house. We have to make it visible. It has to be at eye level or need to have some signage that points it out and really points you in that direction. I say here mindless walking. If you don't know, those grocery stores, they designed the store to sort of guide the way you walk. So you naturally go from one section to the next. And we can use those same techniques to guide people directly into the produce or directly over to the canned vegetables or frozen fruits or vegetables. We can use those same techniques. We also need to try and appeal to this sort of hedonic decision maker by making these things look good and taste good. The argument that it's good for you just isn't going to work in the moment, right? We also, and I'm just going to tease this subject, we need to think about the stores and the retailers and their part of it. And I know we're going to end up talking more about that as soon as I'm done. But some key factors are going to end up being controlled by the packaging and by the marketing of the products. And those might be out of our control, or at least partially out of our control. We are also going to be affected by the contracts with the manufacturers that affect placement and the bundling and the promotion in the stores. And somehow we've got to fit our nudges all around those and not step on anybody's toes. And I'm hoping Tim will just address that and take care of that issue so we don't have to worry about it. In conclusion, I do think these same behavioral techniques hold tremendous promise when it comes to SNAP participants and grocery store shoppers in general. I think this is a fertile ground where really there hasn't been much done to try and promote the healthier foods in this sort of context, trying to access that thoughtless shopper. And that means I think it'll be that much more effective when we start, right? The first gains will be the biggest. I think there's huge potential. We do need to be very, very careful about how we insert ourselves into that relationship between the shopper, the retailer, and the manufacturer to make sure that we don't end up doing more harm or leading to that pushback. And I will quit there. Thanks.